This week on The Watchman, it's left a trail of destruction and terror across the Middle East. Now ISIS has set its sights on the West.
This gang is a particularly destructive one whose unifying logic, whose unifying narrative is of undying hostility between Islam and the West.
We take an in-depth look at how ISIS threatens America and Israel and how it can be stopped. It's The Watchman. It's Christians united for Israel only on TBN. And welcome to a special edition of The Watchman. Well, it's the world's most notorious and brutal terrorist organization, raping, pillaging, and beheading its way across the Middle East. Folks, I'm talking about ISIS, the Islamic State. It has placed a bullseye on the back of every Christian, Yazidi, Kurd, and Muslim that does not agree with its genocidal worldview, and it has attained great success, conquering an area of territory in Syria and Iraq that is roughly the size of Indiana. That's astounding, and it's happened in a short frame of time. Now, ISIS has taken some hits, taken some lumps through coalition airstrikes, through Russian airstrikes over the past several months, but now ISIS is expanding its reach globally. Folks, look no further than the horrific terror attacks in Brussels, in Paris, and yes, right here in the U.S., in San Bernardino, California, where back in December 2015, two ISIS sympathizers, a husband and wife team, slaughtered 14 innocent Americans. What ISIS wants to do is not only stake its claim in the Middle East, but expand beyond the borders of Syria and Iraq and target Europe and the United States. And so far, folks, it is having great success. FBI Director James Comey said recently that in all 50 U.S. states, the Bureau is investigating ISIS-related activity. So what the director of the FBI is saying is that the barbarians are not just at the gates, they are inside the gates. And the Bureau, according to Director James Comey, is overstretched, trying to keep up with all of the ISIS-related cases right here in the United States. What ISIS wants to do is create a guerrilla war zone type atmosphere right here in the United States, where you're seeing an attack like we saw in San Bernardino, Paris, Brussels, Fort Hood, Boston. You're seeing those sorts of attacks in U.S. cities on a regular basis. Europe already is feeling the brunt, and we've had at least 5,000 European citizens, folks, Brits, French, Germans, Danes, leave Western Europe, travel to Syria and Iraq to join ISIS, and now they are trickling home. We live in perilous times, ladies and gentlemen, and ISIS is really a sign of those times. Here's a closer look at the world's most vicious terrorist organization. Savage brutality is unrivaled in modern times. Beheadings, burnings, crucifixions, slavery, and according to the U.S. State Department, genocide against Christians and other religious minorities. These are some of the horrific trademarks of the Islamic State. At its peak, the ISIS Caliphate covered some 36,000 square miles of territory in the heart of the Middle East. Since then, airstrikes by a U.S.-led coalition of nations and by Russia have helped slow the ISIS momentum in Syria and Iraq.
But slowly but surely, the fight is moving against ISIS in terms of territorial holdings on the ground in both Syria and also in Iraq.
Yet ISIS is expanding its reach elsewhere, with growing affiliates in Libya, not far from the shores of Europe, and in Sinai at Israel's doorstep.
What's happening, unfortunately, is that they are going more and more into the international terror business as a way to maintain that sense of momentum.
For ISIS, that means more attacks like we've seen in Brussels, Paris, and San Bernardino. At a recent nuclear summit in Washington, world leaders warned that ISIS wants to acquire nuclear materials to attack the West. In addition, ISIS has threatened to kill all Jews and conquer Jerusalem. And despite setbacks in Syria and Iraq, ISIS remains the world's richest terrorist organization, reportedly taking in up to $2 billion in annual revenue. Now, folks, I know this is some very heavy information to take in, but the Bible says that God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power and of love and of a sound mind. We here at CUFI, Christians United for Israel, want to educate you each week with this show, and I can't think of a better educator than General Michael Hayden. He's not only the former director of the CIA, but also the NSA, the National Security Agency. I sat down with him recently to talk about the war against ISIS and radical Islam and his great new book, Playing to the Edge. Take a look. Well, General Hayden, thanks so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Eric.
We have the West under threat, General. We've seen Paris, we've seen Brussels, San Bernardino. How serious is this ISIS threat to the West, and do you fear that it could metastasize and threaten us even more in the days to come?
Yeah. So here's how I draw it out. Right? I kind of put this graph in the air between us and say, if this is the level of danger we were in on September 10th, 2001, and of course, even people in my profession didn't know how bad it was then, but now we do. If this is where we were on September 10th, I would actually tell you, Eric, because of the hard work of two administrations, and I don't have to remind you, fairly different administrations, right? Because of the hard work of two administrations, we have been able to push that line down. And we pushed it down for about 10 years. But then in about 2011, it started to come back up. And here we are now in 2016. I don't think we're anywhere near September 10th yet, but we are less safe today than we were 1, 2, 3, or 4 years ago. And if we don't get our act together on multiple levels, that line is going to continue to rise until it rivals that level.
Yeah, we were talking before the interview, General, about what happens over there in the Middle East and even in Europe increasingly affects us here. Why should Americans be concerned right now about what's happening in Iraq, in Syria, in this ISIS caliphate?
Right now, there are some things on this planet that require America if they're going to be done. So at a first level, how can you be indifferent at 250,000 to 500,000 innocents being killed in Syria? So that's one reason to be concerned. The second, more pragmatic, it doesn't stay there. I mean, the modern age, the post-industrial, global internet, World Wide Web, interconnected age has jammed together the good and the bad and the strong and the weak in ways we have never seen before. So there is no way we can look at so much evil here and believe it will not fairly quickly actually begin to affect us in really meaningful ways.
General, you've worn so many hats. Director of the CIA, the NSA, 4-star general. You see this ideology festering right now. We have thousands of Europeans potentially have left their comfortable homes in the West, gone to Iraq and Syria to join ISIS. Dozens of Americans, at least, according to U.S. intelligence, have also gone over. How do we combat the ideology? Because terrorism's a tactic, it's driven by this ideology.
That's
How
right.
do we combat that ideology?
Right. You can suppress the message. All right, I mean, they're very active in social media and so on. So I guess there might be some merit in pushing back on that so they're not nearly as agile as they would like to be. But fundamentally, that's not a winning hand. All right, the winning hand is actually putting out a different message. The winning hand is putting out something more powerful than the hate that they choose to send out. You know, when people used to ask us at the agency, why do people join ISIS, or when I was there, why do they join Al Qaeda? And actually, one of the answers we gave is it's a lot like joining the Crips and the Bloods. And in fact, it has more to do with the Crips and the Bloods than it does with the Holy Quran. In other words, what you've got is this body of youth that's alienated, isolated, frustrated, and they're, just like people in South LA, are looking to identify with something greater than self, something to give their life more meaning. And so there's a parallel dynamic, but I really do have to add, Eric, it matters what gang you join. And this gang is a particularly destructive one whose unifying logic, whose unifying narrative is of undying hostility between Islam and the West.
Do you think ISIS is going to grow from here? They've taken some lumps in the Middle East. And in a broader sense, what's a strategy? It's a broad question.
It's hard. And I talk about this in the book. In fact, this is the fabric of the book. And the underlying theme is this is hard stuff. And it takes a long time. And very dedicated people work on it. And the choices, the operational choices, the political choices, and the moral choices are really hard. I've said to other audiences, Eric, this is all a field of gray. There is no obviously clear white moral high ground and no obviously black moral lowland. When the options, what I'm talking about, our options, the options that are available to us are always difficult. And what I try to do in the book is to say that a free people gets to stay free by not running away from those hard choices or demonizing their fellow countrymen who may be on the other side of this or that political issue.
General, thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
No,
Good luck with the book, Playing to the Edge. Coming up after the break, what does ISIS want? I sat down with an ISIS expert to talk about the group's apocalyptic ideology and what it means for you. It's the Watchman. It's Christians United for Israel, only right here on TBN. Stick around.
We see it all over the internet, newspapers, and television as terror groups like ISIS, Hezbollah, and Hamas terrorize Israel. Each year, the threat increases and intensifies. Will you pray for Israel? Will you confront government officials on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people? How will you answer God if you choose to do nothing?
To see evil and not call it evil is evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. God will not hold us harmless. Stand up and speak up and do it now.
Join Kufi, where 2.5 million Christians across the U.S. are working together to defend Israel in our classrooms, churches, and communities. They have an active presence in over 300 college campuses and mobilize their members to communicate pro-Israel perspectives to elected officials. Visit our website, cufi.org.
And welcome back to The Watchman, only right here on TBN. Well, we've seen the beheadings, the slaughter, the terrorism, but terrorism is only a tactic. It is driven by an ideology, and the ideology of ISIS is one that is apocalyptic and end-time centered. They really mean what they say. And I sat down recently with ISIS expert Will McCants of the Brookings Institution right here in Washington, author of a great new book called The ISIS Apocalypse, to talk about what ISIS really wants. In your book, you write so eloquently about the ideology of ISIS, Will, and their views. Is a climactic kind of showdown with the West, is this central to their belief system in ISIS?
They believe it's coming. They believe that this will climax in an end of days battle. But they also believe that events can go the other direction, that there may even be a truce at some point between the West and the Muslims, because prophecy also says that will happen. So no matter what happens then, they will read it through the lens of prophecy. So yes, they believe there will one day be a showdown, but they're willing to interpret events in different ways depending on how it goes.
Yeah, I think that's one of the great things about your book, Will. You delve into this prophetic outlook of ISIS. You know, a lot of people don't talk about that. Terrorism, obviously, very effective tactic for ISIS, but it's driven by this ideology, and a lot of it is kind of centered on these Islamic prophecies. Tell us a little bit more about their belief system in terms of bringing these prophecies to light in the modern day.
Right, so there are many Islamic prophecies of the end times that are found in Muslim scripture, and most of them say everything goes down in Syria and Iraq. So whenever there is a major political upheaval in Syria or Iraq, it invites this apocalyptic interpretation. Now what's fascinating about ISIS and what differentiates it from many other Sunni Islamist groups that are fighting is that ISIS is alone in saying that these prophecies are coming true today. And they use it to recruit people, and sometimes they make battlefield decisions according to these prophecies.
Tell us about a town called Dabiq and why that's so important to ISIS, this town in Syria.
Right. It's a tiny town outside of Aleppo, which was one of the major cities in the north. And in this village, there's a prophecy that says that the end times battle between the Muslims and the infidel armies will happen in this village called Dabiq. And so they went out of their way in 2014 to capture this village in anticipation that the end times battle would happen there.
Wow. And it's a pretty, if you look on the map, it's a pretty insignificant place.
Extremely.
I guess you would say.
Extremely.
It's very interesting. Now, look, they've declared a caliphate, which has loomed large in the imagination of radical Islamists for centuries. Is that serving as a magnet for Muslims, radicals around the world, to come to the Middle East and join ISIS?
Yes, it's a huge draw. And what's fascinating is to contrast them with the locals, the local Iraqis, the local Syrians who join ISIS. Usually they're doing it to draw a paycheck, or they want to be on the side of the guys that have the guns. For the foreigners, though, particularly for the Westerners, they get very excited about this religious vision. They don't know much about Islamic theology or law, but this religious vision, this idea that God's kingdom on earth has returned, fires their imagination, and many of them come to fight in order to be a part of it.
So in terms of the West, we have many Americans today may say, okay, the Middle East is thousands of miles away. It doesn't affect us here. Why should Americans care about the rise of ISIS and this apocalyptic ideology that you're describing?
I think they should care for two reasons. One is that many of our partners in the region are threatened by the rise of ISIS. It's taking over territory and it's threatening some of our traditional allies in the region. And I think first and foremost, that should be the worry. The second worry, of course, is that they will carry out attacks in the West. And look, these terror attacks are not an existential threat in the way that Soviet nukes were an existential threat. But what they do is they tear apart our politics. They make us suspicious of one another. They can really pick at the fabric of our open societies.
ISIS seems to covet Jerusalem as part of their caliphate. How important, I guess you would say, is Israel on ISIS's chopping block?
If you had asked me a year or two ago, I would say it's probably pretty far down the list in priorities. They would love to control Jerusalem. They believe that prophecy is going to be fulfilled there, but it's probably fifth or sixth on the list of places they want to go. That has moved up, and they are beginning to deploy many more resources to try and build cells inside of Gaza, for example, and their affiliate in Egypt is also pushing towards Gaza. So they have much more interest in Israel and violence in Israel.
Will, thank you so much.
That's my pleasure.
Well, folks, we say often on this show that Israel is the first line of defense for Western civilization. Well, in the fight against ISIS, it could be said that the Kurds, the Kurdish people, are the first line of defense. And after the break, we sit down with a representative from the Kurdistan regional government here in Washington to talk about her people's fight against the Islamic State. It's the Watchman. It's Christians United for Israel, only right here on TBN. Don't move.
One of the most important elections in American history is around the corner. Palestinian terrorists are seeking to kill Jews on the streets of Israel on a near daily basis. Iran, the world's leading sponsor of terror, is receiving billions of dollars in sanctions relief. Save for Israel. Christians across the Middle East are being persecuted and killed. If there ever was a time to stand up and speak up for Israel, that time is now. Join Christians United for Israel, America's largest pro-Israel organization, in our nation's capital on July 18th and 19th for our annual Washington Summit. During this two-day educational event, you'll hear from a host of experts and leaders, including CUFI founder and chairman Pastor John Hagee, Lieutenant Colonel USMC Oliver North, and IDF Major Elliot Chodoff. You'll also have an opportunity to spend time on Capitol Hill with elected officials, attend the Daughters for Zion prayer conference, and your children will be able to attend Camp CUFI, a fun, age-appropriate Christian learning experience. To register, call 1-877-706-2834 or log on to cufi.org.
And welcome back to the Watchman, only right here on TBN. Well, the Kurdish Peshmerga are renowned for their bravery on the battlefield, and they've made great gains against ISIS. They are a tough people and a proud people, and I recently sat down with the representative of the Kurdistan Regional Government here in Washington to talk about her people's fight against ISIS.
ISIS is a constant threat. It's not a theoretical war. It's not just a concept. It's on our doorstep. ISIS is only maybe 30 miles outside of the Kurdish capital. It's still within range. It's not a massive distance from where all the minorities, the Christians, Yazidis, and others are sheltering, having escaped the genocide. It's real, it's kinetic, it's active, and it's a real threat. And it's constant. The Peshmerga every day are fighting ISIS. We have a 650-mile border or front line with ISIS. Constantly there are attacks, constantly. They use chemical weapons, not just chlorine, but also mustard gas, which is much more lethal. And even civilians have been killed and injured in these chemical attacks. They use every tactic, chemicals, massive suicide bombings. By massive, I mean tons and tons of explosives on these massive armored vehicles that just come at you like a Mad Max style kamikaze attack. It's not maybe the blitzkrieg of the Second World War. So they use every tactic. They're brainwashing children that they've captured to be future terrorists. They use children in suicide attacks. They use women. You just don't feel safe in any way. It's a real war. It's a real threat. Over 1,300 Peshmerga have been killed. Thousands have been injured. To be honest, not in the fighting. Our Peshmerga are very courageous. They fight. And ISIS actually are not so brave. They're either high on drugs and they're on a suicide mission, or they just send other people out to be killed. Our Peshmerga are fighting. Where we have a lot of casualties is from the IEDs, from the unexploded devices, from TNT, from mines. This is where we get a lot of our casualties. So this is the situation militarily. But what I'm really happy to say is that we have pushed back ISIS. We have won back a great deal of Kurdish territory from ISIS, so that now they are out of almost all of the Kurdish areas in Iraq. We're protecting 1.8 million refugees and displaced people. Among them are Kurds, Arabs, Shia, Sunni, Christians, Yazidis, Shabaks, Karkayis, lots of other minorities. They're all being protected by the Peshmerga. So when Daesh or ISIS comes along and says that it's okay to rape and enslave women just because they're Yazidi, it's okay to throw people out of their homes and kill them just because they're Christian, we don't accept that, because we don't believe in that. We don't believe in that kind of society. We don't believe in that kind of Islam. To us, they're not Muslim. To us, they are just purely terrorist. Our culture is to fight for liberty and freedom and to fight for democracy. We're on the path to democracy in Kurdistan. I don't pretend that we've got everything right, that we don't have problems in Kurdistan. Absolutely, we do. But we're on the path to democracy, and we believe in this kind of peaceful coexistence, and we will fight to preserve that.
Coming up, my final thoughts on why the battle against ISIS matters to you. It's a Winston Churchill moment, folks. That's coming up after the break. Stick around.
We see it all over the internet, newspapers, and television as terror groups like ISIS, Hezbollah, and Hamas terrorize Israel. Each year, the threat increases and intensifies. Will you pray for Israel? Will you confront government officials on behalf of Israel and the Jewish people? How will you answer God if you choose to do nothing?
To see evil and not call it evil is evil. Not to speak is to speak. Not to act is to act. God will not hold us harmless. Stand up and speak up and do it now.
Join Kufi, where 2.5 million Christians across the U.S. are working together to defend Israel in our classrooms, churches, and communities. They have an active presence in over 300 college campuses and mobilize their members to communicate pro-Israel perspectives to elected officials. Visit our website, cufi.org.
And welcome back to the Watchman on TBN. You know, folks, history teaches us that when a great evil rises, it must be crushed decisively before it has a chance to grow and to fester. We saw this during the 1930s when Adolf Hitler and the Nazis told the world what they wanted to do, and they set about trying to do it, and they got awful close, if not for men like Winston Churchill. He was a man who saw the gathering storm of Nazism rising. He spoke out about it. In many cases, he was ridiculed, but he was proven right. Today, where is that great world leader that sees the gathering storm of radical Islam? Folks, for my money, the only world leader right now on the international stage who is telling the truth about radical Islam and calling it for what it is the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. And just as Winston Churchill was initially ridiculed, Benjamin Netanyahu is facing a lot of criticism for telling the truth about the likes of ISIS, Hamas, Hezbollah, and the Iranian regime. Here at Christians United for Israel, we will continue to sound the alarm about these gathering threats that affect every one of our lives. First Chronicles talks about the men of Issachar, an elite group of 200 men who surrounded King David. The Bible says they knew the signs, they knew the times, and they knew what Israel should do about it. Folks, today we need men and women of Issachar to step up and join us here at Christians United for Israel for such a time as this. God says through the prophet Ezekiel that if the watchman or woman does not sound the alarm, he or she will be held accountable. So join the movement. Join with us here at Christians United for Israel as we stand for Israel and stand for America against the likes of ISIS. Thanks for joining us this week on The Watchman. Until next week, God bless you. And remember, never hold your peace.